My name is Rebecca Pierce. I'm a Black and Jewish filmmaker, activist, journalist. I come from a multi-faith, multi-racial family. My Jewish family are Ashkenazi Jews from Europe. Just so y'all know who I am. I work a lot with different communities across Israel and Palestine on issues of human rights. A lot of my focus is on prisons, militarized policing, and a lot of my work has also been with the African asylum seeker community, and we're going to learn a little bit about that today towards the end. Just so folks are aware, tonight's presentation involves a lot of testimony from these different communities about the impact of prisons and policing on their lives. So this includes relaying stories of trauma. So if at some point this gets kind of intense, like it can for folks, feel free to step out. I'm not going to take it personally. Sometimes I have a really hard time with this, and I'm the one doing it. And I want to talk a little bit about, yes, are you able to, up? Let me see. I'm not sure if this has a volume control or not on it, but I can move this up here. Is that better? Okay. All right. Can folks hear? Is that better? All right. So I was talking about, okay. One of the reasons I do this work specifically focused on prisons and policing is it's something that affects me personally. I have family members that are incarcerated, and a lot of what I see is the joint struggle between Black folks and people of color in the US and Palestinians is because of this. I think for Jewish people of color, a lot of the times our voices and perspectives in left-wing organizing, specifically Palestine solidarity, can be kind of overlooked. And I think we have something really unique that we can bring to these spaces. A lot of Jewish solidarity with Palestinians is done along the lines of kind of white allyship. I'm not able to be anybody's white ally because I'm not a white person. But what I can do is try to put forward an idea of shared struggle to be in solidarity with Palestinians because it's the right thing to do, and also because I know that the same systems affecting them are affecting me here. So tonight's talk, I'm going to be going through the roots of policing in prisons in Israel and Palestine, and then talking about how that affects Palestinians, how that affects Israelis, and how that affects people who are neither, specifically African asylum seekers in Israel. So just to give us a little bit of a historical kind of background, I want to talk a little bit about the colonial roots of the Israeli system. So between 1917 and 1948, there was a British colonial mandate in Palestine. The police in this mandate and the prisons in this mandate were, in the part of the British colonial system. And what this means is that the first police that the British brought were former Black and Tans from Ireland. These are the British colonial forces that were repressing the people in Ireland. So everything that you've heard about being Irish folks being subjected to was actually, those same tactics were used against both Palestinians and also the Jewish settler community prior to the creation of the State of Israel. So today, many of the Israeli detention facilities that Palestinians are held in, if not most of them, are former British prisons. This includes the Russian compound, which is a prison that you will hear a lot about tonight. And many of the Israeli policies that we're going to be talking about, like administrative detention, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a bit, these are actually British colonial laws. And when they're being used in the courts, they're referencing these same old law books. Okay. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about mass incarceration and how that affects Palestinians. Since 1967, something like 800,000, probably more actually at this point, Palestinians have been incarcerated. This is from the occupied territories. So this is about 20% of the population, or 40% of Palestinian men who've experienced this. There are currently almost 5,500 Palestinians from the occupied territories, that's the West Bank and Gaza, and Jerusalem, that are being held in Israeli custody. And when people talk about apartheid, specifically that term, when they're applying it to Israel, they're referring to the use of two separate legal systems being applied to people. And one of the key pieces of evidence of this is the existence of the separate military court system that Palestinians are subjected to. Now, if you look over here, you can see some statistics. This infographic is from Adamir, which is a really important Palestinian support organization. So yeah, this is where I'm getting a lot of my information from. You'll notice that there's a really big gender gap in how many women are incarcerated versus men. You'll see that reflected kind of in the videos where a lot of the people talking are men, but it has to do with who is like comfortable being in front of the camera, and also who like the largest number of prisoners are and what I'm able to access. Administrative detention is a policy in which Palestinians, and in very rare cases, Israeli settlers, are held without charges indefinitely in Israeli prison. And usually this is done using secret evidence, and so you won't even necessarily know what you're being accused of or what the evidence against you is, and you can be held for a really long time. One example of this is Khalida Jarrar, who is a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. She was held in administrative detention and recently released. She was never charged. She's been in and out of Israeli prison for years because of her work. But even as a prisoner, she was able to be a leader in her community. She helped tutor girls who were getting ready for their high school exit exams, which in Palestine is a really big deal. And it's a really hard test. Palestinians have a very high bar for education, and she was able to help at least 3 of those girls pass their exams while they were in prison. So I just want to make it clear, even as we're talking about incarcerated people, they do not need our pity, they need our solidarity, and they themselves are often the leaders in our community. So I'm going to show a clip. This is from my work with Friends of Sabeel North America, which is a Palestinian Christian organization. And this is dealing with the issue of children in the Israeli prison system, in the military court system. You're going to see these kids are actually in this video, are from Jerusalem, which means that they are not necessarily going to go through the military court system, but how they're being treated is representative of pretty much any Palestinian who's arrested, including adults. There's very little difference, studies have shown, in how children are treated versus adults when they're arrested. I realized, some of these videos have issues with the sound or titles. The first 3 things that the woman in this video says are mass incarceration has a devastating impact on every community it touches. And from them, we're going to go. And the woman speaking in this video is Nadia Tanous, who's a Bay Area Palestinian activist. She's also a Jew of color, because you can be both Jewish and Palestinian.
Has a devastating impact on every community, but nowhere is that impact more traumatic than where children are affected. In Palestine, 20% of the population will spend part of their lives in Israeli prison. And between 500 and 700 Palestinian children are incarcerated by Israel each year. These children face widespread abuses, from basic denial of due process to torture and solitary confinement. In the West Bank, Palestinian minors are subjected to an Israeli military court, separate from their Jewish peers. It is the only child military court in the world.
لحظة الإخراج عن المسؤولية. الأطفال تعرضوا لها كانت منذ لحظة الاعتقال وحتى مرور المحكمة وحتى ثلاث سنين.
كنا نلعب على الجنبة اللي اجوا المستعمرين أخذونا، دبرونا بالسيارة الشرطة، أخذونا على القيادة، الشجرات، وبعدين أخذونا على شارع صلاح الدين.
كنا نمين بأجوا نزيد اسمها يعني فكرة ما نحصلش كنتيجة زي إنكم سبات وسعويلي وخضار زي القطع سيدي.
أول ما تكون في المرضى على مسافة دايما مرة وخطين إياهم. لما رحنا على الشجرة نروح أجل الضابط يفك لي إياهم على أي شيء يفك فيه، لا يجوب البلداء أو حالة. ونزلت كل البلاستيك عريضة وولعت، لكن نزلت عريضة شوي صار يسلسل علي وحضرت على الدين.
One of the most important violations against Palestinian prisoners is the denial of due process. Israeli interrogators will often deny Palestinian child detainees access to their family members and lawyers, and fail to inform them of their rights.
وقال لي في 3 شروط إنك أنت منعناك إياهم، إنك ما يكون محامي معك في التحقيق، والتاني ما يكونش عندك قراية، وإذا بتسكت بيكون الحق عليك يعني مثبت عليك القضية.
وإذا محامي يعني القانون كمان المفروض إنه يقرر أنا أروح أنا أول حاجة بتصل عليه يقول لي دول تشتم ما يكونش سبق سنة 5 سنة يعني أقول له المحامي اتصل عليه يقول لي لا ما اتصلش علي أنا دفعت.
كانوا يعني حتى إذا مستفز يعني ولكنه أخوك محمد اعترف عليك وعلى مكابي دخل على أبي. قلت له أنا عليه قلت له يعني كذبت له علاء محمد سيبهم جابوا لي هم زي مسدين جابوا لي على وشهم يعني ضعوا سيد بعدين قال لي عصوا علي بحق يعني وكلبشني ويعني قال لي لا توجهك.
لما طلعنا ضربت أنا بركة فقام كلبش وهيك مقصود يفرق من الضرب. وقعدنا أنا وياه لما روحنا هلا قلنا إنه حق إذا بتعترفوش انتوا التنين أنا عشان أبوي محبوس عقلي نمنع من الزيارة ومتشوفوش.
Solitary confinement is also a common practice in Israeli interrogation and detention. In 2013, Defense for Children International found that 20% of Palestinian minors in Israeli custody were held in solitary confinement.
فأنت تطلب منهم يقعدوا قريبين من المسجد ساعة إنه خلص بقى ساعات تخرجات مخدرات أنت خليك احكي لنا إيش عملت بعطيك كل شيء. لو عملت قد إيش الساعة يقولوا لنا 5 المغرب يكون 5 الصبح يقولوا لهم جوا عيان يجيبوا لك اللي يجي لك دكتور خدها يحبوا هنا. طب أعطوني حرام أعطونا شيء يعني يجيبوا لهم يسخنوا يا ده اللي اشتريت تسألنا على الجو.
Of course, the Palestinian prisoners suffer from torture, ill treatment, degrading treatment, lots of other violations while in prison, like banned on family visits, isolation, physical attacks and punishments.
المسؤولية أصعب من السجن. عشان هاي للتوقيف يعني مش مركزي. يعني كيف ما أقول لك مدني مع أمني مع الأسرة مع المنطقة الجارة مع هذا.
مش حلو. بعاملوك يعني كأنك حيوان وما بيقدرش فيك تكلبش مش عارف تمشي ولا تضربه يخدع فيك. طريقة مش فقط يكون حجر ويفرجع يكون الفرحة استجابة أو ينيموك على يقولك تخلص كويس وأحلام يقول يوسعك. هيك الحمد لله بتشيل هواك.
المسؤولية للأولاد يعني الصغار سبب كتير ما مش شوية. يعني أنا ما يمر ويقرأ وعمرت يعني كل له افتح لي الباب ما نطلع عندي الشارع. هو عليه لو تقرب من نقطة تطلع ولا الباب يصير يسقوا عليهم. أما لازم يقولوا على الأروع يعني مش إما مش إخوتي وأخواتي وأهلي. زي اللي يروحوا سائر وكل طريقات.
يعني اللي بقوله انه كلام ما بوصلش كامل الحقيقه علشان تصير داخل محكمه مسؤوليه والدور الاهدافي يعني برضه معنيه ان توضح للعالم انه في قانون محكمه مسؤوليه وفي اجراءات عملها بتصير قانونيه. بتصور العالم لازم يعرفوا انه في اخطاء بتستهدف حقوقهم اثناء المحكمه واثناء الاستشهاد.
All right, so in this video, we just saw, Palestinian child prisoners talking about their experiences. One thing I want to say is the companies that were referenced at the end of those videos, they're not only have a history of being involved in the incarceration of Palestinians, but G4S is an international security company based in the UK that has contracts running youth detention centers in Florida. I believe that a lot of their Israel contracts were canceled, which was actually a really big victory for this campaign. But it's important to understand that the same people profiting off of incarceration in Palestine have been the same people profiting off of incarceration in the US, the UK, and around the world. So Palestinians also face incarceration from the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. It's really important to note that the Palestinian Authority does security cooperation with Israel. So there's certain contexts where people are actually arrested by the Palestinian Authority on behalf of Israel. They can even be interrogated, and the PA does use very brutal tactics, including torture. The PA also has its own interest in defending its own power, and a lot of the same activists who are, opposing the occupation can end up in running afoul of the PA. Just on a personal note, this photo I took when Palestinians were protesting the PA's role in upholding the sanctions against Gaza last summer. I was arrested that night for taking these photos. The Palestinian Authority police took me off the street. They thought that the white foreign guy I was with was the journalist, and so they were interrogating him. They asked to see my phone, and they deleted most of the videos that I had of them beating people and taking them away. What they missed was my camera and my backpack, which is why this photo still exists. Hamas also has its own detention interrogation system, which I have less access to because I'm not able to go to Gaza. But it's just important to know that recently there were also protests in Gaza where people were not only protesting the Great March and Return protests, but also protesting Hamas policies, and they were also arrested. So it's just important to note that we hold Israel primarily accountable because they are the occupying power, but people are still under threat from their own governments, and neither the PA nor Hamas has had elections in a long time. So it's just important to acknowledge that this is part of the incarceration that Palestinians can experience. So I also want to talk about 48 Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. 20% of Israel is Palestinian citizens, the 20% of the population. They face double the incarceration rate of their Jewish peers, and that's pretty massive when you think about how small of the population they are, and it also kind of reflects something similar to what we have in the US, where a third of our prison population are Black. Israeli citizens killed in recent years have almost entirely been Palestinian, but the exceptions to that are Jewish people of color like Mizrahi and Ethiopian Jews, and in one case, a Russian Israeli was also killed, and this is a population that is technically you would consider them white, but they're still marginalized within Israeli society. And similarly to the US, a lot of the people killed are dealing with mental illnesses and disabilities. And so it's important to understand that that's part of the situation. Palestinian citizens of Israel are subjected to over 65 discriminatory laws. There's a Palestinian legal advocacy group called Adullah that has a really great database of this if you want to see what are all the laws. One really obvious example of this is the nation-state law, which was recently passed in Israel that guarantees national rights only to Jewish citizens. And also it reduced Arabic from an official language to a sub-official language in Israel, which is a way of kind of pushing Palestinian culture underground a little bit. The guy in this photograph, his name is Jafar Farah. He is the leader of an organization called the Masawa Center in Haifa. The reason his leg is broken in this photograph is because during the protests in solidarity with Gaza last summer, he was arrested en masse with a lot of other Palestinians from Haifa who were protesting. They were taken into the Israeli police station and they were beaten, and that's how his leg was broken. We're going to hear from Jafar a little bit about his experience as a Palestinian citizen in Israel when it comes to policing, and also why he thinks that he has some common cause with Jewish communities of color, even as they are pitted against each other. And one thing to note, this video is part of a piece that I'm going to be releasing as a print video. When you hear it, you'll hear why there's construction noise in the background, so I apologize, but we were working with what we could.
We deal also the Palestinian community. Israel, we deal since 48 with oppression of the Palestinian community until 66. Actually, we have been living under military regime. So actually, the oppression and the control of the Jewish majority, or parts of the Jewish majority of the Palestinian community Israel have been always, and we paid the price, In the land in 67, 6 people in 76, sorry. 6 Palestinians have been shot and killed, and it was a issue struggle around land. In October 2000, during demonstrations that have been related to much more Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem, 13 Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel have been shot and killed by police officers during the demonstrations. The last Gaza demonstrations, of course, the Palestinian community community inside Israel feel that we should show solidarity and also stand with our brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip. And in Haifa especially, the police forces and the government took a decision to oppress the demonstration and to use serious violence against it was a big demonstration actually, 400, 500 people. I was injured actually in the police station. So almost everybody that have been arrested, or 21 people have been arrested in this demonstration. Almost everyone have been beaten in the police station, and my leg was broken, and let's say, I can't say that it's massive use of violence, but it was brutal treatment that peaceful demonstration have been dealt with by the Haifa police station. And I don't think that it was local. It was a message to the Palestinian community that you can, try to play with what's so-called democracy in the Middle East. You can talk about certain issues, but you can't talk about occupation. We should finance the occupation. We should pay taxes to finance the occupation. Maybe to send some of our kids to be soldiers in the Israeli army, to be part of the occupation, but not to oppose the occupation. And that was the message of, it's not only the police station in Haifa. I think it's a message that 2 weeks before a demonstration that had been taking place in Jerusalem against the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem, the same violence had been used against elected people. Even Knesset members that have parliamentary immunity have been treated in the same way. But if you look at different communities in Israel, I told you that 46 armed citizens have been shot and killed, but I will tell you that also 3 Ethiopian Jews immigrants. And if you look on were shot and killed by police officers in Israel. So in this sense, if you take all the separated communities, almost 2 million people, 20% of the population. If you take the Russian immigration, of 1 million people, if you take all these minorities in Israel, you discover that most of these communities, they suffer themselves from systematic discrimination. Even the Mizrahi community in Israel is suffering from systematic discrimination. But hate speech is feeding actually them to hate the Arabs, to occupy the Palestinians. So in this sense, you have a system in Israel for the education system, the army, that its goal actually to spare communities and to prevent any kind of human solidarity in communities. And we as a Palestinian organization, we have a challenge in one side to take care of our community, but in the other side to understand that this policy of separation and segregation and racism is a policy, and social economic discrimination is a policy that have a lot of support when it comes to practices against us, but in different ways, it's also something that's practiced against different communities, and it's very important that we show it also to the different Jewish communities that they will understand that at the end of the day, the only future of the Jews and Palestinians in this region is peace, is solidarity between communities, is social justice, and we have to mainstream this agenda.
So now I'm going to transition into talking a little bit about Jews of color communities in Israel and Palestine. For some transparency, the term Jews of color is actually mostly a US type of umbrella term. And usually in Israel, you will hear people refer more specifically to different communities, and there isn't always the same framework. The reason I use this framework is I'm part of an organization that's connected to JVP, the JVP Jews of Color Sephardi Mizrahi context, where we are actually all organizing together, and it's sort of a shorthand, but just so you know, you're not gonna necessarily hear that term in Hebrew. One of the largest populations in Israel, actually the majority of the population, are Mizrahi Jews. These are Jews with a background in the Middle East and North Africa, or sometimes they'll say Jews from Muslim countries, but this can also include actually like Greece, the Balkans, and other countries. There were some Mizrahi Jews who were in Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel. There were Palestinian Jews. There were also Jews from Yemen who had come as sort of like to work, and they were often exploited by the like colonial system. Anyway, so when we talk about Israel, I think it's really important to understand Zionism. Zionism is an ideology that was created by Ashkenazi, that's Jews from mostly like Central and Eastern Europe, in response to anti-Semitism. Their solution to anti-Semitism, which was like a very real and urgent problem that people were facing, was the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Not everyone supported this ideology. There were a lot of Jews in Europe who didn't agree with this. There were a lot of Jews in places like Iraq who also didn't agree with this, because for many people, felt like they were part of the societies that they were in, and that wasn't the best choice for them. It's important to also acknowledge that a lot of this was happening in an explicitly colonial framework. Today, you will hear a lot of people really strongly objecting to any claim that Zionism has anything to do with colonialism, but we know that like Theodore Herzl was writing letters to Cecil Rhodes about how he really envied the project in Rhodesia and wanted to be able to, or like the colonial project, and to be able to emulate it. So, like I was saying, the majority of Israeli Jews today are not from this European Jewish background, and because of that, even though the majority, they do face like cultural erasure and discrimination throughout the society. So I'm going to show a video about the Israeli Black Panther movement. One thing to say, and they'll talk about this in the video, is that for a long time in Israel, because there was like not a very visible, like darker skinned African population, the term black was used to describe Mizrahi people. That is like changing now that the demographics have changed, but that's why you'll hear the term Black Panthers being used by people who, some of whom are black because they're from like Africa, but some of whom are like lighter skinned Maghrebi people or from the Middle East. So just some like clarity around that. One thing I'll say is like also Jews of color and Mizrahi Jews are not any more politically inclined to be left wing than anyone else. And we're going to hear from someone who is a very like outspoken anti-Zionist Mizrahi Jew. I think what he's saying is really important. It's really important to understand how he's contextualizing the struggle. He's a very beloved figure in the society, but he's also not representative of every Mizrahi person. So just be aware of that, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. So this is a video I made for Jewish Voice for Peace with Reuven Abergel, who is one of the leaders of the Israeli Black Panthers.
עצמי גר בתוך שטח ההפקר. עכשיו, הירדנים והישראלים חתמו על הסכם ברודוס שיהיה ביניהם גבול. יהיה ביניהם גבול. בהסכם שהם חתמו, אמרו, זה הגבול, זה הקו שיהיה בין ירדן לישראל. אנחנו היהודים שבאנו למדינת האסלאם, באנו לישראל, ואין לנו פרגון. מהמלחמה, הכל היה שמור, היו פה איזה 100 חדרים, 100 משפחות, עם הרבה ילדים בחדר אחד. נכנסו, ישבו, אין מים, אין חשמל, אין סניטריה, אין שימוש עם כלום. כי למה? הכל שבור. אנחנו אף פעם לא ראינו, לא ראש עיר ולא פקיד של המדינה בשכונה שלנו, או כאן. אנחנו הכרנו יותר את הירדנים, החיילים הירדנים שהיו פה, יותר מאשר היהודים מאירופה. כל השנים אנחנו נשלם את המחיר של המניפולציות של הפוליטיקה הישראלית. כל זה נקרא שכונת ממילה, שזה היה אזור תעשייה וגם היום בבתים של הפלסטינים אז. ואחרי 48 היהודים שבאו מעיראק נכנסו לגור שם. כל פעם שיהיה אקשן בין הציונים לבין הירדנים, אנחנו נמצאים באמצע והם יורים בום, אנחנו מקבלים את האש. הירדנים שהיה אקשן בין הציונים, היהודים ובין הירדנים, הירדנים היו יורים, כמו שאמרתי, 28 אנשים מתו שמה מהיריות של הירדנים או של הישראלים, לא יודע. אבל אז הדבר היחידי שהיה לי לעשות בתור ילד זה לשחק במקום. והאבות שלי, כלומר, אם עשיתי משהו לא טוב במדינה הזו, זה כשאני הייתי ילד שלא היה לי מה לעשות, אלא היה בקטע ולא כלום, והיו עוצרים אותנו פה ברחוב ולוקחים אותנו למגרש הרוסים שם. אני בגיל 9 כבר הייתי בבית הסוהר פה. ובזמנים שלי כשהיה פה בבית הסוהר, במגרש הרוסים, לא שמו ילדים לבד ומבוגרים לבד. כולם, כל הקרים האלה גדולים והקטנים כולם יחד. כמובן שיש הרבה פדופיליה שם, יש הרבה דברים לא טובים, אין מיטות, במצווה. בשבילי בתור ילד זה טראומה. לפני 48 זה היו אנשים לא הכי עשירים, אבל לא עניים. היו רופאים, עורכי דין, ארכיטקטים, מורים, מנהלי בית הספר, זה אנשים שיש להם הרבה כסף. וכל אחד בנה לעצמו בית שלו פה. כשאנחנו נכנסנו, אז כל משפחה לקחה חדר אחד. ואם בכניסה היה 4 חדרים, אז נהיה 4 משפחות בתוך הכניסה, וכמה נהיינו 40 איש. 40 איש, עכשיו אם היה חתונה, היינו עושים שעה. אם מישהו מת, היינו בוכים שעה. אם היה חינה, היינו עושים שעה. ואנחנו רואים פה את הסלאמס. זה הפרופיל של הסלאמס. כשהג'נטריפיקציה נכנסת, אז מוציאים את האנשים מהאדמה, כי למה? תראי פה בית כזה יש 4 משפחות.
מוציאים את האנשים האלה מפה, ומעבירים אותם פה בתוך בניין כזה, דירות של 39 מטר, קטן, כן? 39 מטר עם 10 ילדים, ומכניסים אותם פה 50 משפחות. 50 משפחות זה 500 איש. 50 משפחות כאן זה 500 איש. 1,000 איש במקום, זה מקום קטן. כן, 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 כן. בשנות 1970 עשו את ההפגנה הראשונה, או במקום הזה, מול ראש העיר. בזמנים ההם אנחנו חשבנו שהבעיות שלנו זה בגלל ראש העיר ולא בגלל הממשלה. כשהחלטנו להתארגן ולהתחיל לדבר על הבעיות שלנו, מה שהפריע לנו זה המצב של ההורים שלנו, מצב של הבית שלנו, מצב העבודה, מצב החינוך, מצב הבריאות, כל הדברים האלה שבן אדם צריך להיות בו. אז מה שהוא עשה, הוא ביקש מהעובדים שלו פה להביא עיתונאים ולספר להם כמה הם עושים עבודה טובה עם הילדים. עכשיו הביאו את הילדים לכאן עם העיתונאים ועשו קונפרנס, ואחרי הקונפרנס העיתונאים שואל את הילדים מה אתם רוצים לעשות כשתהיו גדולים? אז הם אומרים אנחנו רוצים להיות עבדלים. כן, כמובן למחרת בעיתון, הכותרת של העיתון כתוב יש פנתרים במוסרח. ואז הם הכינו דף כזה שכתבו עליו 10 דברים, די לאלימות של המשטרה, די ל10 בחדר אחד, די לעומק של שמנים, די לזה שאין חינוך, די לזה שאין גן ילדים, די, פיניש. הוצאנו את כל המאבקים של הפנתרים. אחרי כמה חודשים של המאבק, יצאתי לעניינים שלי עם הפנתרים, חזרתי, מצאתי את הבית, הכל באש, שרפו את הבית, כולו.
זה פוליס? המשטרה?
שב"כ, משטרה, אנשים שהמשטרה הבאים שלהם, כן. כלומר, היום, כבר אחרי 45 שנה, אף אחד לא אמר לי איך נשרף הבית, למה נשרף הבית. ככה מצאתי את עצמי מחוץ לשכונה, כן? ועזבתי והלכתי למקומות אחרים. כשניהלנו את המאבקים, בהתחלה התחלנו כמו ילדים קטנים שלא מבינים הרבה, וכל יום שעבר העיניים שלנו נפתחו, למדנו הרבה דברים, ולאט לאט הבנו שהחוקרים והחוקרות שלה זאת התנועה הציונית. לכן הם לא יפסיקו את הכיבוש, כי הם יודעים ברגע שהכיבוש ייגמר, הם יצטרכו לתת דין וחשבון ליהודים הערבים. כי היהודים במדינת ערב שנמצאים פה נהפכו לחיילים ונהפכו לחלק מהצבא והם שותפים לליכוד שגם של הפלסטינים וגם של עצמם. אבל זה לא אומר שאנחנו המזרחים בשום בשקט היום. אנחנו כל הזמן מנהלים מאבק מול השלטון הלבן. אנחנו מנהלים את המאבק כל הזמן. כמובן שחזרו הרבה שנים, כבר 46 שנה מהיום הראשון של המאבק, הרבה פנתרים הלכו מן העולם. של הסגנון של הרוביש, אוקיי? ונגד האשכנזים ונגד הציונות וזה, כן? אפילו שהמצב טוב אצלם בבית, הם יודעים שחסר משהו להם. לקחו להם את הזהות, לקחו להם את התרבות שלהם, והיום יש רנסנס של הצעירים שחוזרים אל התרבות הערבית.
So a couple notes, I'm sorry, I think there was a playback issue, but we're working with what we can. So when Reuven talks about this like cultural renaissance that's happening, he's actually a really big part of that. The song in this video, which is being sung in Arabic, is by a Moroccan Jewish woman named Netta Al-Khayyam, and Reuven actually wrote the lyrics to that song. Another thing I want to kind of address is like Reuven is like really staunchly anti-Zionist, and this is, like I was saying, not a super common position among Mizrahim. One of the many reasons for this is that for the folks who are coming from different countries around the Middle East to Israel who are Jewish, they had like a lot of different reasons for coming. For some folks, it's because they were religious Zionists. For some folks, it's because they were being kicked out of their homes. The Jewish population in Iraq, who were in many cases very left-wing, often like part of the Communist Party, were scapegoated and had their property seized by the king. And this forced people to leave. And a lot of those people have been really resistant to the idea of coming to Israel. There are also folks from Yemen and other countries who are facing incitement. And so there isn't one single Mizrahi story, and I just want to be really clear about that. But part of the division has to do with people having experienced like being scapegoated by nationalist groups, and like it's not just Jewish people who experience that. There are a lot of religious and ethnic minorities around the Middle East who have experienced this. So I just want to be really clear that that's one of many reasons why some people hold very like right-wing positions. Also, some of the policies that were being used against Mizrahi Jews in Israel were put in place by what is referred to as like the Zionist left governments, like the labor governments in Israel. So under the labor government, people were being put into transit camps when they first arrived, where they had very little access to like any basic services. They had really strict work situations where like if you left your job, you could be arrested. People had to change their names from their like traditional Arabic Jewish names to like more Israeli names, and this was done through like pressure put on people. And so there is an association for some Mizrahim with the left and racism against them. And of course we can talk about what left means in this context and like how left a Zionist left is or whatever, but like this is part of the attitude of why people can be like very right-wing. But it's also a stereotype to say that all Mizrahi Jews are right-wing, and that you will hear this on the Israeli left today, and it's something that we really need to push back against. So I want to talk for the rest of the time about Black communities in Palestine and Israel. There are a lot of different Black communities. We're not going to cover all of them today. I'm just going to cover the ones that I've been able to like have extensive work with. The first to keep in mind are Afro-Palestinians. Palestine is where Africa meets Asia and Europe, right? So you're going to have movement of people through and from all these different countries. So there are Black Palestinians, and they have like actually a tremendous diversity among the Black populations in Palestine. You have like Afro-Palestinians in Jerusalem, who are kind of the most famous or like well-known Afro-Palestinian community. The woman at the top is from this community. These are folks who are descendants of people who went on Hajj to Saudi Arabia from Chad, Sudan, other countries, and ended up staying in Palestine. And a lot of them live near the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Old City of Jerusalem. You also have Black Bedouin communities that may or may not call themselves Black, but are definitely discriminated against in Israeli and Palestinian society due to their darker skin. You also have people who are descendants of the Arab slave trade, and you have people who came along a lot of other different routes. Ethiopian Jews are one of the main like Black Jewish populations in Israel. We're going to talk a little bit about them next, so you'll hear more about that. African asylum seekers from Sudan and Eritrea. We're going to talk a little bit more about them. You also have other Black folks who are classified as migrant workers from like West and sub-Saharan Africa. I want to be really clear, like while a lot of my work does focus on people who are specifically seeking political asylum, as far as I'm concerned, there's no moral difference between someone who immigrates for like economic reasons and someone who immigrates for political reasons. Economic pressures that are put on formerly colonized countries, to me, are political, and there's nothing that makes you more, just in seeking, a safe place where you can support yourself based on economic or political factors. They're connected. Another community are the Black Hebrew Israelites. These are historically Black Americans who have come, who are part of like a sort of Black nationalist religion that is based mostly actually on the Christian Bible, but sort of identifies itself with Judaism, I think in part because of the story of the Exodus, which was really important in Black communities when we're talking about like liberation theology. You may have had contact with some Black Hebrew Israelites in the US. Some claim to be like the real Jews and that other Jewish communities are not really Jewish. The community that immigrated to Dimona has sort of like, doesn't make this claim. And they face a lot of discrimination in Israel, including police violence. The only way to become an Israeli citizen if you are a Black Hebrew, they're not recognized as Jewish by the Israeli government, is to have a kid from your family join the Israeli military, and then the rest of the family gets citizenship. And this is like part of a broader system where your rights are really bound up in military service, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last group are like, there are Black Mizrahi Jews. They're like, some folks from Libya and other countries are like darker skinned, and even Yemen. And they can also face anti-Black racism or colorism in their communities. So I want to talk a little bit about Ethiopian Israelis. This is a community that practices a form of Judaism that is older than the form of Judaism I practice. They practice a form of Judaism that is basically connected to the period of the Second Temple. And what that means is that they trace their Judaism patrilineally. It means through the father, unlike a lot of Jews who trace it through the mother. And they practice a priesthood rather than a rabbinate. Like they have priests rather than rabbis, and this goes back to the traditions of like some of the earlier forms of Judaism. Even though their Judaism is very old and like documented and should be recognized, it was not recognized by the state of Israel until 1973, which meant that people who tried to come from Ethiopia to Israel were deported. A lot of people walked across the Sinai, which is the same trek that African asylum seekers were taking until very recently. And once they got into Israel, if they were discovered, could be deported. Today, they're about like 1.5 to 2% of the population of Israel, which is like a very small minority, but because they're like darker skinned Black folks, they're very visible, which creates a lot of racism against them. And again, like I was saying, they were not recognized as Jews for a very long time, and today still can be denied access to like Orthodox religious schools, and it can even be denied the right to marry in Israel. In Israel, there's no such thing as civil marriage. You have to be married by the rabbinate, which is like a religious government institution that can decide if you're Jewish or not Jewish. There are times when Ethiopian Jews are like denied status as Jewish people under this. For a lot of Ethiopian Jews, you will hear folks who are very like gung-ho about joining the army, but also the army creates a lot of burdens on people at the same time. One of them is that for like young Ethiopian Jews in Israel, you're often one of the major breadwinners in your family, and so when you go and join the military and you're not being paid very well, a lot of people walk off their posts to go make money for their families because otherwise it's impossible to survive. And if you do that, you're put in prison. So something like 40% of Ethiopians who serve in the Israeli military end up in military prison. They also, there's also a very high suicide rate because of the pressures that are put on people. This year, there were massive protests, and like every few years there are, of Ethiopian Israelis protesting police brutality. The picture here is of a protest following the killing of a man named Yehuda Biadga, who was a Ethiopian Israeli who was suffering from mental illness, who had a knife in his hand and was shot by the Israeli police. And there's like a lot of cases like this that happen. And this picture is kind of significant because this highway is like the Ayalon freeway, which in Tel Aviv is like the main thoroughfare through the city, and they completely shut that down. And when you shut that highway down, you shut down Tel Aviv. So this was like a very big moment. So a few years ago, with a Israeli like left-wing documentary filmmaker named David Sheen, I did some interviews with folks from the Ethiopian community who were on strike from their army reserve duty. You'll hear a lot about people refusing military service in Israel, usually in solidarity with Palestinians. In this case, it was to protest what they felt was the breakdown of the social bargain in Israel, where like if you're told that if you serve in the army, you're gonna get the full rights of being a citizen, and they felt that we're not getting any of the rights of being a citizen, despite serving in the army very enthusiastically. And I wanna be clear, like, I'm talking about social conditions. These are not excuses for anyone serving in the military. They're not excuses for anyone participating in the occupation, but I think it's really important to understand the social factors that are fueling like violence against Jews of color and also violence against Palestinians. So in this next clip, I'm gonna show some of the guys who are part of this strike, some of the leaders in this strike talking about racism in Israel. And this is part of a 12-part series. You can hear them talking about a lot of things, including some clips where they're very enthusiastic talking about the army, and some clips where they're talking about how they're actually learning from Palestinians about how to resist. And so it's a really complex issue, and we're only gonna see a little bit of it, but I just wanted to give some background on that.
בגלל שכל יום שמגיע לארץ, תוך שבוע-שבועיים, מתחילים מה שנקרא לקלוט את המדדים של האנשים. אם אני אלך ברחוב, אתה תלך ברחוב, אנשים יסתכלו לנו בצורה אחרת. היום עכשיו, אם אנחנו נלך עכשיו ברחוב, יהיו X אנשים שאנחנו כאתיופים מזהים את המבט הזה. אנחנו נזהים את זה. זה מין יצר הישרדותי שאנחנו מזהים את המבט. אנחנו מכירים את זה. זה מבט כזה שהוא מין מבט מזלזל, אני לא יודע איך להגדיר, אבל אנחנו קולטים את זה. ואנחנו מאוד ערים, ואני אומר אנחנו היום מבוגר, גם ילדים קטנים. ואז אתה, מה שנקרא, מתחיל לעבוד, או אתה מנסה להתחיל לעבוד, ואז יש לך קורות חיים, ולא חוזרים אליך, או שאתה מגיע למקום עבודה, ואז אומרים לך, שמע, לא בדיוק איך תקבע סרטים. מצד שני, מישהו שבא אחריך ולהתקבל לעבוד. אז כל מיני דברים כאלה שאתה אומר, רגע, האנשים שחיים פה, יש בעיה מאוד גדולה. אתה מנסה להבין, אני זוכר אז שבאתי מחבר ואומר, תשמע, זה גזענות, אתה יכול להגיד גזענות, זה מילה קשה. אני שומע גזענות קשה, הפעם אתה לא אמרתי. ארצות הברית, מרטין לותר קינג, זה מה שעולה לי בראש, הגזענות. ואז אתה ממשיך לחיים שלך בהרצאה. ואתה פתאום מבין שהגזענות הזאת, שאני בהכרח לא רציתי להתייחס אליה, או קיוויתי שזה לא גזענות, אתה פתאום מבין שהיא לא רק אצל האנשים הקטנים, אלא היא נוספת. לגמרי נוספת. אתה יודע, אנשים, ברור שאנשים ישתמשו בגזענות, וגם היום, השאלה שלנו לא כלפי האזרח הפשוט, כי האזרח פשוט ילמד את זה. כמו שהוא לא ילמד, אבל אני אמשיך לחיים שלי. אבל כשהגזענות היא נוספת, וכמו שדג'ה אמר, שממערכות החינוך, מערכות המשפט, משטרה, לימודים, זאת אומרת, אני לא יכול באמת לחיות את החיים שלי, החיים שלי מסרטים, אני צריך להתמודד מול מערכת, והמערכת לא עושים את זה לצאת. ואנחנו פה במדינה הזאת, שמה שנקרא מדינת ישראל שחרתה כמדינה שלך. אני אומר לעצמי, לא הגיוני שמדינה שחרתה שואה. אני כסיס גזע. אין פה... זאת אומרת, אנחנו כמדינת ישראל אמורים להבין את העניין הזה של גזענות הכי טוב בעולם. אנחנו צריכים להיות הראשונים שקמים וצועקים שיש גזענות כלפי קבוצות אוכלוסייה מסוימת. הראשונים. הראשונים שנבוא ולהגיד, הלו, זה גזענות, אנחנו קראנו כבר, ואצלנו לא רוצה. אבל במקום זה אנחנו הופכים להיות הראשונים שמתחילים. אנחנו הופכים להיות הראשונים שעושים. ואנחנו גם לא מצטערים, אנחנו לא אומרים, כי אין מה לעשות, אין מדינה טובה. או טובה. טעינו, חשבנו שזה טעינו. אין בעיה, אין שום בעיה להגיד טעינו. אבל פה זה לא טעינו, זה להצדיק את המעשים, ואני לא זה לא גזענות בכלל.
Okay. Sorry, again, it looks like we're having like playback delay. I'm gonna give folks time for a break in a few minutes, but I just wanna give some more context after this video. So folks have an idea of what discrimination in Israel has meant for the Ethiopian community. When folks immigrated, they were being sort of taken out of transit camps in Sudan, where people had gone fleeing like famine in Ethiopia. And before they were allowed to enter Israel, women were often told that if you want to go to Israel, you have to get this shot. That shot was a Depo-Provera shot. Depo-Provera is a very extreme form of hormone birth control or chemical birth control that can sterilize a person. And so it's believed that this policy actually cut the birth rate in half of Ethiopian Jewish women. This is a eugenics policy, right? Medical racism is a really big part of what Ethiopian Israelis experience. There was a really famous case where a woman who was a member at the time of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, went to donate blood, and she was basically told that she could donate if she wanted to, but her blood was going to be thrown away because they were worried that she had HIV or other diseases. And this is believed to be a very widespread policy. Like I was saying earlier, there's like discrimination in Orthodox schools, which a lot of time might be the best local school that you can access. People will be either not allowed in or face like a lot of bullying. There's racism in the job market. There's racism even in terms of the army, which is people's main path of upward mobility. The types of jobs that you can serve in the army are very much tied to race and class. And a lot of times Ethiopians will end up being in like combat roles, which is in some cases considered to be like a position of honor, but it's also putting you in the most direct danger. So yeah, I could go on about this for a really long time, but and also, Ethiopians were forced to give up their historic form of Judaism in a lot of cases, including the traditional priesthood. In some cases, men's circumcision, which is a really important thing in Judaism. It's like a symbol of the covenant with God. A lot of times that wasn't recognized, so people had to go through something that a lot of converts go through, which is to have like a needle prick done. And it was like really traumatic for people because they didn't always understand what was happening or why they were being asked to be circumcised when they had lived their whole life as Jews and had been circumcised at birth. So you can see there's like a lot of really painful and personal weight that this racism has had on people. One of the things that I found really interesting talking to these guys, and also I've done like several different sets of interviews with folks in the Ethiopian community, is folks will not call themselves anti-Zionist. In Israel, Zionism is almost sort of used as a shorthand for like a good citizen or patriotic. But they will fundamentally question like the basic setup of the state by saying Israel establishing itself as a Jewish state has resulted in us being discriminated against because we're not seen as full Jews. And so Israel should be a state of all its citizens. And I think that statement is fundamentally in opposition to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. So I think when we talk about Zionists and Zionism, it's important to remember that there are people who are living in a way that's actually and fundamentally like in opposition to Zionism and their beliefs are, but at the same time might be calling themselves Zionist for like cultural reasons. And it's not an excuse. It doesn't, and some of these same people will be like very racist against Palestinians. But there are frameworks for another idea or understanding of how to have a state that are occurring in some of these minoritized communities. And I think it's really worth trying to engage them more. I only have 2 more slides and then we'll have some Q&A. All right, so the next sort of community that I'm gonna talk about, which is like the last community we're gonna go in depth into, are African asylum seekers in Israel. I'm working on a full-length documentary about African asylum seekers in Israel. That's why I have a lot more background working with this community. So at this point, when I first made this presentation 2 years ago, there were around 40,000 African asylum seekers in Israel. Now it's like probably around 36,000. The reason for this is that Israel has a lot of policies that basically pressure people to leave, and we're gonna talk a little bit about what that looks like. Most of the asylum seekers in Israel coming from the African continent are from Sudan and Eritrea. The vast majority of these folks are from Eritrea, actually. In Eritrea, folks are fleeing both like economic deprivation and also compulsory military service. Basically, you have to join the military and you're not paid for your work, and you can be held indefinitely. And a lot of times what's called military service is like building roads and infrastructure and things. folks from Sudan. A lot of them are from Darfur and are fleeing the genocide in Darfur, but also other political and social issues in Sudan. There was a very large South Sudanese population in Israel. A lot of these people had kids in Israel. They were deported en masse a few years ago, and a lot of those people have died. Basically, if you're an asylum seeker in Israel, when you are brought into the country, you are, at the time, people went through the Sinai, crossing through a really dangerous situation where you could be held hostage by Bedouin tribes in the Sinai, and basically they would, and this happens throughout the African continent, it's not just here, they would hold people, torture them, and call their family members while they were doing so, and demand ransom. It's important to note that in some cases these people have connections to other Bedouin groups on the other side of the border, so there were times when people were sending their money to Israeli phone numbers and things. And this is one reason why there's some tension between the asylum seeker community and Palestinians. Another thing that's important to note, Israel has since, I think in 2010, started building a border wall that completely stopped African asylum seekers from entering the country. When Trump talks about basing his border wall on Israel, this is the border wall he's talking about. It's an anti-Black border wall. Okay, so when you enter Israel, or when you entered Israel as an asylum seeker, folks can't really do that anymore. They would sort of begin a process of declaring themselves as asylum seekers, and they were supposed to be recognized after this process. Israel, in almost every case, has refused to do this. There's a very small number who have actually received asylum in the past few years, and Israel basically keeps people in a state of limbo where you never know what's going to happen. Seeking asylum, African asylum seekers are criminalized under amendments to the 1952 anti-infiltration law. Does anyone want to guess who that law targeted originally? I'll just say it, it's Palestinians. This was a law that kept out Palestinian refugees and also Fedayeen fighters. And so there's a direct connection structurally, as we've seen throughout, between the oppression of African asylum seekers and the oppression of Palestinians. So one of the ways that you are punished under this law for many years in Israel was in detention in a facility called Holot. This is an immigration detention center built exclusively for African asylum seekers. There are many, many, many more undocumented people from Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe, and other countries in Israel than there are African asylum seekers, but there's been a very specific anti-Black campaign to incite against them and punish them for arriving. So there's also a tremendous amount of labor exploitation because people are not given protections under the state that you're supposed to be given. There's a law called the deposit law in Israel that was passed a few years ago, where if you are an African asylum seeker, 20% of your paycheck is taken by the Israeli government. It's supposed to be given to you when you leave the country. It's an incentive to leave. But activists have caught up with asylum seekers who did voluntarily leave the country, basically under pressure left the country, and almost none of those people have received their money. And this is part of a greater context of corruption that's not just targeting these people, but really clearly their money is being stolen from them by the state. There are a lot of cases in which people are told if you leave Israel, you'll be given X amount of money and sent to a safe country. Those safe countries were Rwanda and Uganda. Activists have gone to these countries to see what happened to the people who were being sent there, and in almost every case, they were only in the country for about 2 weeks before being trafficked to Libya. And this is, again, feeding people into the global migration crisis that is happening right now. And Israel, like many European countries, is basically refusing to uphold its basic obligations under international refugee law. And Israel has a particular place in international refugee law because Israelis were part of drafting the refugee conventions that actually grant these people their rights. And so the repeated shirking of that, it's inhuman, it's part of this greater context of colonialism, but it's also, a sort of abandonment of one of the claims of Israel, which is that it's a haven for Jewish refugees. While, of course, creating Palestinian refugees and refusing asylum to other refugees. I'm going to show a clip from, this is actually from my documentary, but we released it through the Jews of Color Caucus, JOCSM caucus at JVP. We have a blog that we run, and one of the things that we did was, I guess I should give some more background. So in 2017, in November, the Israeli High Court ruled that deportation was an acceptable punishment under the Anti-Infiltration Act, which meant that every South African asylum seeker in Israel could be deported. And there was a massive plan to deport all of them. When I heard this was happening, I basically booked my ticket to go back because I'd already been working with this community in the Holot Detention Center. And the Jews of Color Caucus worked with African asylum seekers. We worked with Palestinians on the ground and in US communities, and also the American Jewish community, to try and have a campaign to put pressure on the Israeli government not to deport these people. So we put out a video. This is an interview I did at the Holot Detention Center, which you're going to learn about with one of the asylum seekers, who's is also one of the main characters in my documentary. And just so people know, Holot has actually been closed now. The reason it was closed was during the deportation process, Israel thought that it was going to be sending all these people away, so there wasn't a need to put them in this detention center, which is really about pressuring them to leave. Holot was an open detention center, and what that means is people were technically allowed to exit the premises. I did a lot of my interviews in the parking lot, but the rule was you had to check in 3 to 5 times a day, and Holot is on the Egyptian border. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the desert. The nearest communities are Israeli kibbutzes, and then also Palestinian Bedouin villages that are a little bit further away. And so people are really isolated, and there's nowhere you can really go within the amount of time people had to leave. So this was a way for the Israeli government to present itself as humane while being the complete opposite, which is a pattern I think we're familiar with at this point. And one thing I'll add, I don't know if it's mentioned in the video or not, is the facilities were made out of shipping containers. So people are living in the desert where it goes from being extremely hot during the day to extremely cold at night, and living in a tin box. They were being served rotten food. A lot of the times the asylum seekers would open their own restaurants outside of the detention center because they had to supplement the nutritional needs that were not being met in the facility. And there's exposure to bugs and different things you can imagine. Also, what makes Holot so cruel, and Holot, by the way, in Hebrew means dunes or sands. So it's we're sending you to the sands. That's what was being said to people. Holot is very close to where many of these people also crossed the border. It's also right next to the prison that they were held in when they first arrived. So this is a way of re-traumatizing people after this horrific journey that folks were forced to make. Many of them had lived in Israel 5-8 years at that point, and they're being sent back to a prison right where they cross. So psychologically, what's being done to people it's another form of torture, really. So this interview I have is with Blitz Iyasu, who is a really awesome, nice leader in this African asylum seeker movement, which we'll talk a little bit about after the video. And I want to make it really clear, the asylum seeker movement is actually the reason why the deportation stopped. So these folks, with the help of Israelis and the international community pressuring them, these folks saved themselves. So again, we don't need to go rescue these people. What we need to do is advocate for them to have half a chance, because they're very capable of taking care of themselves.
My name is Boris Iyasu. I'm 34 years old. I'm from Eritrea. I
friend has been covered and there are 3 people. The 2 people have been right away, but one has been covered. He's still in prison since 2009, December. So if you think that what's going to happen to me is going to be, I'm sure that I cannot say 100% conservation, but I have prisoners like what my friend faces. I know that these kind of people, they don't know what's problem. Because there was many examples of official governments report something about bad things for us. Like there are criminals, there are rapists, there are cancers, there are so many supports. Whatever they say, I don't care. But me is me. I don't care to my behavior or another race. I'm the one who came from a town which has a dictator, who has more than 10,000 prisoners. And a lot of people that are working for like criminals and us. And we are the people who are, we are treated by people, not by nobody, it's by people. Relating poverty is just, a man doing nothing, just, the whole day waiting for eating and cooking foods, like rice, like doing nothing, just, the day comes, the night goes, the day comes, like this, we don't have anything. I'm not studying that. I don't have facility. I need to continue my education, but I don't have any access to education. So, but I can say that it's better than my country, being living more, because I know that if I go, I can't say anything which is going to be over 10 days, and then I'm moving forward, not like this. So the whole thing is, I can say that it's better than being in Rebbeca, but it's very shameful being here when you compare with other people's countries. Even those people are living in model, we are still of details, they cannot speak in both, they can be able to and win. Because they feel that Israeli government will come back and then our fortune is going to be underground. So, to me, whatever this minister or message, the one that office, they say until they force me or they threaten me with this before we can make the blame, I will wait for everything whatever they do. Okay? For what purpose?
So like I was saying earlier, the deportation plan was canceled. The reason for this was the Israeli Supreme Court, which had opened the door for deportation to begin with, basically determined that the Netanyahu government was lying when they said that they had safe countries to send these people to. The asylum seekers protested outside the embassies of Uganda and Rwanda, and those countries basically said publicly that they had no deal with Israel. It's very unclear what was actually going on, but because Israel couldn't prove that they had a place to send these people, they were not allowed to do this. So I want to say something. Okay, so Israel also, I'm going to go back to this image. Israel has diplomatic relationships with the governments of South Sudan, of Eritrea, of a lot of other African nations. It's trying to build diplomatic relationships with Sudan, and they sell weapons to these countries. So when I asked an Israeli activist, like, why are you in solidarity with the asylum seekers? She said, well, because it's the right thing to do for the same reason that I would be in solidarity with Palestinians, because like a lot of these folks are like part of the left. But she also said because we're fueling the conflicts and governments that these people are fleeing. And that's like definitely true. And Israel has done a lot to build diplomatic relationships and sell weapons to countries like throughout the African continent, to countries in Central America, to US Customs and Border Patrol. And so it's really important to understand, like, when this guy's holding this sign, he's referring to the fact that, like, in some cases there were allegations that Israel had offered to, like, give money and weapons to some of the countries that these folks were being sent to, and this amounts to human trafficking. So, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. That's about it for this presentation. I'm going to open it up to questions if that's okay. And I understand, like, this was really intense, so thanks to everyone for sitting with me and just, like, hearing all of these different stories. And if we don't have questions, I'll go eat dinner. Yeah?
So we talked about how, police brutality, mass incarceration, just the issues within the criminal justice system in general, and deportation are tools with which, like, we have state violence and state repression happening in Israel and Palestine. What are some other ways in which the Israeli government is kind of like perpetuating this violence and oppression other than the ones that we discussed?
So one thing, I think if you're talking about actually both Jews of color and asylum seekers, like, and I mentioned this a little bit, but like the military as a social apparatus, if you don't serve in the army, you can go to jail, first of all. You also have a lot harder time getting a job. A lot of jobs require army service. So if you are, for example, a Palestinian citizen of Israel and your community doesn't have a deal with the government that you have to serve, that's like a really easy way for people to not hire you for a job because they can say, oh, we're prioritizing soldiers. And that also goes for the asylum seeker community who aren't citizens and don't serve in the military. Also Ethiopians, if they try to even just get out of their army service for either religious reasons or economic reasons, it's really hard unless you're like upper middle class to do this, they can also face like systematic discrimination. Again, also housing discrimination is totally legal in Israel. Totally legal. There's nothing barring it. And if anything, the nation state law actually, in part of its encouragement of national rights for Jewish people, encourages like Jewish-only housing being built. So that's like another thing. And I think also very similar to the US, where we've had racially restrictive housing covenants that, kept segregation in place. Yeah? Yeah.
How, like, they both tie through the Israeli government.
Yeah, totally. So like I was saying, there's the basic like thing is the Anti-Infiltration Act, but also like people, I think it's important to remember like labor is a huge issue here. Both Palestinians and African asylum seekers are kind of used as cheap labor. They don't have a lot of times, because they're not Israeli citizens, the same protections that Israeli workers do. And for the Palestinians especially, who are like the folks who have to cross the checkpoint every day, there's a tremendous amount of wage theft. There's a tremendous amount of like work injuries and discrimination and other things that happen. And African asylum seekers can be subjected to similar things. Also just like state incitement is a really big thing. Politicians in Israel, there's a tremendous amount of corruption. We know the prime minister has been like almost indicted over and over again. And there's also a lot of like bad distribution of social services. The entire welfare state in Israel was moved to the settlements to encourage people to go there. So there's so much economic deprivation in communities. And the easiest way to like distract people from this is for government officials to incite. And they incite against Palestinians, calling them terrorists. And they incite against African asylum seekers, calling them criminals and rapists. And this is, of course, really similar to the anti-Black language that we have in the United States a lot of the time. There's something else I was going to say, but I just forgot it. Sorry. If I remember, I'll let you know. Yes?
Yes. What information do you have about the Israeli government's working with the Trump administration, or even the Obama administration before that, on the U.S.-Mexican border wall and the security systems, LBIT specifically, and even the design of sectors of the border wall are designed in Israel?
Yeah, so there are Israeli companies, like private mostly companies that are like LBIT. Sorry, the question was about the role of Israel in like U.S. border violence and like our institutional and the keeping out of people. So yeah, there are companies like Elbit that make drones. Some of these are combat drones that are used against Palestinians in Gaza. Some of them are surveillance drones that are used in Gaza, the West Bank, all over. And they market this throughout the world. And in the US-Mexico border, there are drones, sensors, and other equipment that are being used to track undocumented people trying to cross and like aid Border Patrol in catching them. Also, it's important to note that in many cases, the border is cutting indigenous nations, like Native American nations, in half. And so there are actually a lot of these Elbit drones and sensors and things are being put on like Tohono O'odham lands. And so it's really important to remember that this is like, again, to track migrants and aid in their capture, but it's also part of the US imperialism in its oldest form, which is the colonization of the North American continent. And was there, all right, that's what I can remember right now.
The design of the wall?
Oh, I know less about this, but that's true that some Israeli companies have been involved in like wall design. Yeah?
Speak a little about what the left versus the right looks like in Israel.
So in Israel, there are two main kind of camps that are they're like politically opposed to each other, but they're not that different all the time. Like, so in the last election, you had like the Netanyahu's like Likud party was making connections with parties that are part of the Kahanist movement, which is like extreme, like very obviously and outspokenly fascist organizations that are like part of a history of fascism in Israel that actually began in the US. The Kahanist movement began, unfortunately, in New York City. But on the sort of a left side, you have like labor and the sort of vestiges of what used to be the sort of Zionist socialist governments of Israel that were part of the founding of the state. These parties have lost a lot of power, but in this election they were making like a stand again, in part through the use of these Israeli like military generals who they're criticizing Netanyahu from kind of the left of Netanyahu, but they're still like these are the same people who said we're going to turn Gaza into a parking lot. These are like people who are involved in extreme violence against Palestinians, and this is supposed to be like. They're really more like centrist parties, but relative to the extreme right, they're considered left. There are also a small number of parties that are like non or anti-Zionist, but they have very little power in the Knesset, and there's a lot of also internal friction between them. So you have like Balad, which I don't even know if they got seats in the last election. This is like a Palestinian anti-Zionist party. And you have like Hadash, which is like socialist, non-Zionist party. And that's not all of them, I'm not remembering. So like there is like a spectrum that actually runs to people who you would see like Jafar's politics that we saw earlier today. But those people are on the very far left are not represented. And but the extreme right is like not only represented, it's actually in some cases crucial to forming coalitions. So yeah.
I had a question about the detention centers. So you said they're quote unquote open.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of flow in terms of employment between the outside and the inside where, I don't know, like asylum seekers would be working for some other kind of group every day or no?
In the like Holot detention center?
Yeah. Or a similar one?
It's almost impossible to have a job when you're in Holot. What people did do was they had little businesses they started outside. So there were like restaurants, like I mentioned, that people would like make traditional foods to feed themselves and supplement the diets they were being given in the prison. There was also like Israeli like phone companies that were like selling SIM cards and stuff, and a really bizarre little mini economy around these places. One thing that's kind of interesting is all this is happening on a military base, and next door there's another closed facility that holds asylum seekers, and also Palestinian political prisoners. So all this is kind of happening next to each other. But it's very hard to have a job when you're in Holot because, they eventually reduced the amount of times you had to check in a day, but there's nowhere you can really go outside of like really tiny little towns nearby. Yeah. Yes?
So one thing that came to mind is like how like birthright trips and different laws that encourage immigration or obtaining like citizenship for Westerners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so I'm going to go back a little further, talk about like what happened with Mizrahi Jews. So like, and then we'll get to this part because I think it's relevant. When the State of Israel was being founded, the Zionist movement had not really considered at all Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. They weren't really trying to recruit them. Or prior to the foundation of the State of Israel, I should say. There was settlement in Palestine by Jewish people from Eastern Europe. And they had a really bad attitude towards Middle Eastern Jews if they acknowledged them at all. What happened was the Holocaust. And half the Jews in Europe were killed, and there were a lot less people from those populations coming over to Israel. I mean, there were a lot of people coming post-Holocaust, but much less than was anticipated. And demographically, there were not enough Jewish people coming into the state to really justify, we can talk about whether that's justified at all, but having a Jewish state when there isn't a Jewish demographic majority. That was when they started recruiting people from around the Middle East and North Africa to come. And so there was no preparation or plan to bring these people. Over the subsequent years, there were efforts to get Soviet Jews into Israel, to get Ethiopian Jews. And today, a lot of the sort of recruiting for there's always a need for more people to come, in part because a lot of Israelis are leaving. There's a lot of people, there's a big Israeli population in Berlin now of people leaving because of the social, political, economic situation in Israel. And so there's a lot of recruitment being done through trips like Birthright, which are meant, I think immigration and joining the army is definitely one goal of Birthright. This is a trip that targets young Jewish folks to go to Israel and experience it in a very touristy way and to kind of do hasbara, which is to sell the state of Israel to this young generation of Jews. They're running into increasing opposition to this. You have JVP's Return the Birthright campaign, which is about totally rejecting birthright. You have If Not Now, which is sort of saying make birthright more balanced, which we can talk about how that's, I don't really think that's possible, but that's one thing that people are trying to do. There's also a lot of recruitment of Jewish people in Europe, specifically France, where there is there are increases in anti-Semitism, there's increases in targeting of people, and so this is kind of used to say, go to Israel, you'll be safe. But of course, Israel is actually the place you're most likely in the world to experience sectarian violence in this way because it's a political conflict. So this is kind of a lie. I actually met this guy. He was a Maghrebi Jewish guy from France who I met when I was secretly trying to film in a settlement to document what was happening in a village nearby. And I asked him why he'd come to Israel. He'd been there 2 weeks. And he said, because I wanted to get away from Arabs. And I said, you're right above a Palestinian village. This is the wrong place to go, if you're trying to get away from Arabs. And, I think earlier there was this quote during the video with Reuven where Ben Gurion is saying he doesn't want Israel to become a Levantine nation. My answer to that is don't put your nation in the Levant, right? If you are so concerned about being European, there's a whole continent of Europe. You don't have to force a sectarian, ethnocracy in the Middle East. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
To go back to the deportation centers.
Mm-hmm.
Is there evidence of the EU being involved in deportation centers and designing them?
In Israel? Not that I know of. There was supposed to be a deal to send a lot of the asylum seekers to Europe, but it's unclear to what extent that deal ever happened. And it was also canceled because Netanyahu's partners in his coalition thought it was being too nice to the asylum seekers to send them to other Western nations. But it wouldn't surprise me at all. And actually there's been some discussion of how Halot and also Australian detention centers have influenced policies around the world of this idea that you can actually keep people in, who haven't committed a crime. It's legal to seek asylum. You have a right. You don't have to cross a border legally, actually. You can be undocumented in crossing, and you can still seek asylum. There's a lot of countries, I think, that have considered keeping people in this type of detention center, in part inspired by Halot. All right, anything else? Thank you. Thanks so much for coming, y'all. You can check out Adamir and Abdullah, who are two of the organizations I mentioned, and also my organization has a blog, which I'll put the website up now. Thanks so much for coming, y'all.